Today we're going to be having a look at exam technique for conflict and tension. A quick reminder first, before we start looking at the exam technique, you need to make sure that you have revised the content for the week. So have you looked at the Treaty of Versailles and German reactions to the treaty? Hopefully you can tick that one off. Have you been looking at the powers of the League of Nations? Hopefully. And have you looked at the events of the Abyssinian crisis? Make sure you revise that before you watch this on technique. The first type of question that we're going to be looking at this week is a 4-mark source question. So this is one of those questions where it's source A opposes, supports, is critical of something. How do you know? Explain your answer using the source and your contextual knowledge. So this question is driven by the source and requires a couple of bits of knowledge to support what can be seen. So you pick out what the source says and you support it with a little bit of knowledge. Here's an example then. So 4-mark source question example. Source A, a British cartoon from 1919. The source is critical of the League of Nations. How do you know? Explain your answer using source A and your contextual knowledge. And here's the source, look. So it's called Overweighted. And we've got President Wilson here. We can see that because it's on the caption here. Here's your olive branch. Now get busy. So go off and get peace out in the world. And the dove of peace, of course I want to please everybody, but isn't this a bit thick? So what we've got here in this particular cartoon is this overly enthusiastic, look at Wilson's face, he's got this really silly grin on his face. Clearly this olive branch is much too big. Look at the poor old League of Nations dove of peace here, can't even fit it into his beak. There's no way that this dove is going to be able to carry this branch. So the League of Nations is the source A is critical of the League of Nations. How do you know? Well, we know because of how Wilson is shown. We know because of the size of the branch and the fact that the dove cannot carry it and the fact that the cartoon is called Overweighted and that we can see the dove itself knows it's not going to work. So we need to be mentioning those kind of things in our answer, and we also need to match that with a little bit of knowledge. So Wilson being shown here to be kind of grinning stupidly and handing it over as if it's going to work. He was seen by the big three as being this idealist, someone who really expected things to go really well, even when the evidence was against that. So we could use that as our first piece of knowledge. We also know that the League of Nations was a little bit overly ambitious at the beginning. It wasn't just trying to create peace, it was also trying to do good works, things like slavery, International Labour Organization, trying to help workers around the world, trying to free up all the refugees and get all the refugees all over the world. There was so much that the League was trying to do. It was also trying to encourage disarmament around the world. So it really couldn't work. If we put all of that together, or some of that together, we're going to have a really good answer. So a reminder of the technique then. Well, what can we see? So again, it's about what we can see Wilson doing. It's about the branch and it's about the dove. And it's also about the actual caption here at the bottom. What do we know about the League? Some of that stuff that I've already told you about, the reputation of Wilson and about it being over ambitious, trying to take over too much. You need to make sure on that you do that 2 times. And that's really important. So what can we see? We pick out one piece of information and then we add some knowledge. Then we pick out another thing that we can see and add another piece of knowledge. That's all we have to do to get a really great answer. Let's have a look at a model answer then. So what do we find out? Well, the question is asking us, how we know that source A is critical of the League of Nations. So we're going to start off. Source A is critical of the League as it shows Woodrow Wilson looking silly with a stupid expression on his face. He is expecting the dove to be able to fly despite it being obvious to all that it cannot. Anyone looking at that can work it out, but he still hasn't worked it out. That's why he looks silly, and therefore we can see that it's being critical. Now we're going to come in with some knowledge. We've already said, well, this is what we can see in the picture. I know that Wilson was extremely optimistic and that other members of the big three saw him as being too much of an idealist and not being realistic enough about what was possible following World War I. So there's not loads of knowledge there, but there's enough. What we've done there for 2 marks really is we've pointed out, well, we know it's critical. We've given some details from the cartoon and then we've given a little bit of knowledge. Let's do that for another observation as well. It is also critical because it's called overweighted. So I've gone to the caption here. The cartoonist believes that the league is trying to do too much, and it's taken on too many responsibilities. So again, just a little bit from the cartoon, I also know the league wasn't just there to keep the peace. It was also trying to make the world a better place and deal with things such as slavery and refugees. The cartoonist clearly believes that the league cannot possibly succeed. That's a good 4-mark answer, because what I've done there is I've picked out 2 things the league said and I've supported that with 2 bits of knowledge. Nothing more complicated than that. Our next question type this week is a write an account of. This is an 8-mark question. So in this particular type of question, what we're doing is we are demonstrating your knowledge and understanding of a sequence of events, a sequence of things that happen. You can explain 2 steps at least of the sequence and link each step back to the question. It will be done in 2 paragraphs in around 10 minutes. Let's have a look at a specific question then. This is not based on any knowledge that we're learning this week, but it's exactly the same as the type of question that you are going to get. So write an account about how the events in Manchuria 1931 to 33 affected the League of Nations. So what would the paragraphs be on? Well, you do 1 paragraph on the background to the incident and the early actions of the League. What did they do at the start? And link to how this caused problems for the League, how it affected the League of Nations. And then you develop that incident in the second one and kind of talk about what happened next and those later actions of the League, and also link this to how this caused problems for the League of Nations, how this affected the League of Nations, so you're making it relevant. There is no conclusion needed here. You do exactly the same if the question was on Abyssinia. So you could have a question asking about how the events in Abyssinia 1935 to 36 affected the League of Nations. Think about how you could use the information to write a similar answer to the model that I'm about to take you through for the Abyssinian crisis. So again, we haven't revised these events. Don't worry about that. I just want you to see the technique of what I've done here. The stuff that I've written in purple is the stuff where I'm linking back to the question. The stuff in green is where I'm talking about what actually happened. I am writing an account of those events. So the stuff where I'm saying how it affected the League of Nations is in purple. The stuff where I'm actually telling you about the account of the events is in green. So let's have a look. The events in Manchuria affected the League and became an issue because of the lack of decisive action by the League. So that's me relating it back to the question. Japan relies on international trade as it could not feed its growing population following the outbreak of the Depression at the end of 1929. It relied on exporting silk, and this market completely died because no one was buying luxuries. This led the Japanese invasion of Manchuria in September 1931. The Japanese needed food for its people and living space. It already had economic control of parts of China and had built a railway in Manchuria. A section of the railway was blown up and the Japanese blamed the Chinese. They invaded. In October 1931, the Chinese appealed to the League. This was now a problem for the League to solve. So this is how it affects the League of Nations. So imagine that you were writing this for Abyssinia. It would be very, very similar. You're going to talk about what actually happened at Walwal and with that original skirmish and the original involvement of the League into February 1935. So for my second paragraph, I'm talking about the later events in the incident. And again, green is where I'm actually discussing the events, and purple is where I'm linking it to how that affects the League of Nations. So again, think about how you would do this for the Abyssinia one. The League investigators did not arrive in Manchuria until April 1932. The report was not finalised until October. This was 13 months after the original invasion. During this time, the Japanese had invaded Shanghai and refused to offer a ceasefire. The offer of a ceasefire, rather. When finally told to leave China in February 1933, the Japanese simply left the League. They then went on to invade Johor. There was no further action taken. The League's failure to deal with the situation speedily or successfully led to greater problems for the League, as other countries who wanted to follow an aggressive foreign policy no longer feared intervention by the League. This led to events like the invasion of Abyssinia by Italy in 1935. So think about what you would write, you could write about the later stuff. You could write about the Hall of Al-Pak, the lack of closure of the Suez Canal following economic sanctions. There's lots that you'd be able to write in this second paragraph if you were writing about Abyssinia. The third and final question type that we're preparing for this week is a 16-mark question. This is worth 60 marks plus 4 marks for spelling, punctuation and grammar, so make sure you spend time correcting stuff at the end and checking for capital letters, etc. So you'll have a statement about an event and how far do you agree with this statement? Explain your answer. So you're evaluating how far you agree. So you write 4 paragraphs. In the first one, you talk about the event that is mentioned in the question. So there might be a question that's saying the Nazi-Soviet pact was the main cause of World War II. How far do you agree with this statement? Or you start off by talking about the Nazi-Soviet pact, not just what happened, but actually linking it to the question how it led to war. Then you pick your second paragraph, or you pick another. And if it was one that was about the causes of World War II, then you give another cause of World War II. You might think about Hitler's aims. If in paragraph 3, you do exactly the same again. And in conclusion, you actually answer the question, well, do you think that thing was the main reason for such and such? How far do you agree with that statement? You actually sum it up, you link the causes together. Let's have a look at a specific example. So this week, the question will be similar to this one here. Loss of territory was the main reason Germany objected to the Treaty of Versailles. How far do you agree with this statement? So the first paragraph is on loss of territory. And then you find 2 other reasons for German objections to the treaty. And there's your paragraphs, because finally you'd enter a conclusion. Let's have a look at a model paragraph then. So loss of territory was a huge reason. So I'm already relating it back to the question. Germany's hatred of Versailles. Now I'm going to go on and I'm actually going to talk about, well, what did they lose then? Germany lost all its empire, 10% of its land in Europe, and I mentioned a couple of specifics, Alsace-Lorraine and the Polish corridor. Anschluss with Austria was forbidden. So the first part of this is just telling you, well, what was the loss of territory? I'm then going to talk about how that led to them objecting. This was too much for Germany to stand. Wilson had talked about self-determination in the 14 points and at the peace conference. What about self-determination for Germany? Millions of Germans were now living under foreign rule. There was a loss of the German homeland. The Polish corridor was another insult. Germany was now physically divided. Loyal Germans could not stand for this in the long term, and this would need addressing in the future. So in this model paragraph, I've not only linked back to the question a couple of times at the start and the end, I've not only given knowledge about what that loss of territory was, but I've also made it clear how that led Germany to objecting to the treaty. So I'm not going to give you model paragraphs on all of it, because you could do this now from the information that you've got. You could write a paragraph on any 2 of the following: loss of pride or war guilt, loss of money, loss of military. You actually could cover them all, because you could deal with, remember that I've said before that loss of pride and loss of money are totally interlinked. You could deal with those 2 together as one paragraph, because loss of pride and the admission of guilt with the war guilt led to Germany having to pay reparations or compensation. So that could actually be just one paragraph, and it gives you the opportunity to write a little bit more and give a little bit more knowledge. Loss of military. So you could cover maybe just 2 of them. You could deal with them separately if you wanted to, or you could actually deal with all 3, as long as you're dealing with pride and money, if you were going to do all 3 in one paragraph. So you could deal with loss of pride and money as one. They're interlinked. By this point, you've got 3 good paragraphs. You've written a paragraph about the loss of territory, the model paragraph that we did together. You've also got a paragraph on maybe war guilt and reparations and why the Germans objected to that, obviously with knowledge first and then why they objected, and a paragraph on the loss of the military and why the Germans objected to that. So finally, you have to write your final paragraph, which is a conclusion that actually answers the question. Was the factor in the statement, loss of territory, was it the main reason, the most important reason for German objections to Versailles? There is no right answer to this. All you've got to do is state your view. I believe loss of territory was the most important or the main reason why Germany objected. You decide. I do not believe loss of territory was the main reason. You then support it and you say why you think that. I think this because. But try and mention all the reasons you have discussed. So in your answer, if you're deciding, yeah, actually I'm going to say it's a loss of territory, but do in your conclusion mention that loss of pride was important or that loss of the military was important. Make sure you mention all of those. Don't, though, give any new information in your conclusion. If you didn't talk about reparations, don't talk about reparations in your conclusion. And a really important thing to do if you want to get those upper levels is to show how these causes were interlinked, how one thing led into another, and how, the territory was very much linked to the military because, of course, they've lost that land, they can't even defend it or get it back. Try and show that interconnection of your ideas. Your job at home now is to make sure you're prepared for the assessment. Remind yourself of the key facts, go back to the other YouTube clip if you need to, and remind yourself of what we've done today, of the question types and technique. That way you will have assessment success.